Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and a very special thank you to those joining us in the middle of the night. I'm Ben Brandzell, and it is my great honor on behalf of the entire Open Network to welcome you to this global call for peace. Thousands of us are gathered here today from more than 20 countries in what we believe is a global first, a massive multinational grassroots conversation about what we can do together across borders to stop a catastrophic war before it begins. We're gathering at a critical moment. Tensions between Russia and NATO allies have reached a new high following a global spiral of election tampering scandals, cover-ups in the Trump administration, international assassination attempts, and a renewed arms race between Russia and the West. The devastating war in Yemen is causing the worst humanitarian crisis on the planet today and escalating deep hostilities between the governments of Iran, Saudi Arabia, and the US that could still explode into even broader conflict. And in Korea, months of terrifying escalation, personal insults, and threats of nuclear annihilation have suddenly given way to a surprise meeting announcement between Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un, a meeting full of possibility and peril. So on many fronts, it feels like the world is on the brink. We face many urgent questions, but perhaps none more important than this. How do we ensure that our collective fate is not decided solely by the fragile egos of power-drunk politicians, but by the wisdom and decency of the people of Korea, Yemen, Iran, Russia, the United States, and the world? We're gathered to ask these questions and search for answers together 15 years after the start of the Iraq War. The legacy of that disaster still haunts us all, and much of today's crisis feels eerily similar. But a lot has changed in that time. We've looked hard at where we fell short, and we've learned. We've grown and innovated new forms of people power in each of our many nations. And most importantly, we've found each other. Because war and peace are never determined by one nation alone. It took many governments choosing war to form the coalition of the willing 15 years ago. And it will take all of us choosing peace to form a new coalition today, a coalition of people everywhere unwilling to sit idly by while the world is once again dragged towards tragic and preventable conflict. To help us rise to this moment together, we are very lucky to have this esteemed panel of experts and leaders. Jenny Town, Christine Ahn, Raed Jarar, and Senator Bernie Sanders. Our speakers are usually found briefing world leaders, global media, and supporting game-changing social movements. They will offer critical context, analysis, and vision to help us chart a path towards peace. We'll hear from organizations in the Open Network around the world and spotlight the efforts of Move On members in the United States to build an inescapable demand for diplomacy. And finally, we'll share and discuss plans for an immediate action that we can take together to help further our initiative after this call. Throughout the hour, please feel free to ask questions by clicking on where it says Ask a Question at the bottom of the screen. You can also click there to see questions already posed by other participants and to vote for the questions that you most want the panelists to address in the final part of the call. You can also see and participate in an ongoing live chat on the right side of your screen. You've probably discovered that already. You're very much invited to use this chat to share your questions and reactions and ideas throughout the call. And that chat will stay open and live after the call to keep the conversation going. Also, please make use of the Twitter hashtag Callfor Peace. So that's just hash CALLFORPEACE, Call for Peace, to spread the word and widen this conversation around the world. I want to thank our translators who literally, as we speak, are making this call accessible in German, Swedish, and French. If you'd like to listen in one of those languages, just click where it says English language session on the top left of the screen and choose a different language option. I'd like to acknowledge our many partners in hosting this call. It was a huge undertaking, and it wouldn't have been possible without very deep partnership. I want to highlight 350, WeMove.eu, Peace Action, and the Predictable Emergencies Coalition, Move On, Win Without War, the ACLU, Rethink Media, and Credo Action. These groups have been working for months to help their millions of members across the United States prepare for whatever national security and civil liberties emergencies these uncertain times can throw at us. And it's exactly that spirit of readiness and responsibility that inspires our conversation tonight. So we're ready for our first speaker. First up will be Christine An. Christine is a lifelong leading peace activist on the Korean Peninsula. Refusing to accept the inevitability of conflict, she organized and led a historic delegation of women from many nations to cross the Korean DMZ, which, as you know, is one of the world's most highly militarized borders. As international coordinator of Women Cross the DMZ, Christine appears frequently in global media and works with grassroots activists in Korea and internationally who are organizing for peace. She just returned from the United Nations, where she was engaging global leaders in support of North Korean diplomacy. Christine will share insights for what people everywhere, that's all of us, can do to help. Christine An.
Thank you so much, Ben. And thank you to all the organizers of this call. It's my great honor to join Senator Sanders, Jenny, Raed, and all of you. I can't underscore enough the importance of this historic moment. And what happens in the coming weeks will very much determine whether war or peace prevails on the Korean Peninsula. The meeting between Trump and Kim is unprecedented. No standing US president has ever met with a North Korean leader, and we may never get this opportunity again. If both sides can't come to agreement, I fear what Trump himself has said, which is that if talks fail, it's time for phase 2, which is war. It's important to understand that we are not here at this moment because of Trump's maximum pressure campaign, which has only caused great suffering to the North Korean people, but rather South Korean President Moon's masterful diplomacy and commitment to a final resolution to the Korean War. Just 10 months ago, Moon Jae-in became president after an extraordinary people's movement that rose up to bring down the former president Park Geun-hye. Her ouster and Moon's election was a clear victory of people power, where over 16 million, one in every 3 South Koreans, took to the streets, and for 5 months they held candlelight vigils. President Moon ran on a platform to end corruption and to improve the inter-Korean peace relations, and he won in a landslide victory. And today he benefits from a 74% approval rating. That is extraordinary. So in his first major foreign policy speech, Moon offered North Korea a peace treaty if they agreed to denuclearize. But as tensions escalated between Washington and Pyongyang, Moon at once condemned North Korea for their nuclear missile tests, but he also sent a clear message to Donald Trump. Quote, "No one should be allowed to decide on a military action on the Korean Peninsula without South Korean agreement," end quote. That's because in the opening days of a military conflict, 300,000 people would be killed. That's only if conventional weapons were used. And if nuclear weapons were used, up to 25 million people would be impacted. So Moon, fearing a preemptive US strike on North Korea, and then of course a counter retaliation by North Korea on the 30,000 US troops on 87 bases in South Korea, he quickly seized the opportunity that was afforded by the Winter Olympics in Pyeongchang, and he called for a truce. And Kim Jong-un, he reached back by sending hundreds of athletes and performers to the Olympics, including his sister, Kim Yo-jong, who's the first member of the Kim family dynasty to land on South Korean soil since their grandfather fought in the Korean War. So the world witnessed the transformative power of engagement in the opening ceremony of the Winter Olympics, when the two Koreas marched together carrying a One Korea flag. Yet as the entire stadium and the entire world cheered on Korean unity, US Vice President Mike Pence and Prime Minister Shinzo Abe from Japan remained seated. It was a sober reminder to the Korean people about Japan's colonial occupation of Korea from 1910 to 1945, which then led to the tragic division of Korea by Cold War powers. Many people don't realize this, but in 1945, it was two State Department officials who literally tore a page from the National Geographic and without consulting a single Korean, drew a line across the 38th parallel. And that is basically how Korea became divided. The US took south of the line and Seoul, and the Soviets took Pyongyang and north of the line. So this is how Korea was divided, and this is how millions of Koreans still remain divided by the DMZ. So that is why at this moment, we must mobilize to build political will for lasting peace for Korea. The outcome of peace or war doesn't just rest solely on a successful Trump or Kim summit, but it depends on our sustained mobilization in this global peace movement. So what must we do? First, we must get educated on the historic roots of this Korean conflict, why North Korea behaves as it does. When Trump threatened to totally destroy North Korea at the UN last fall, he failed to mention that it had already been totally destroyed by indiscriminate US bombing campaigns during the 1950 to 53 Korean War, when more bombs were dropped on North Korea than throughout all the Asia-Pacific theater in World War II. More than 3 million people, mostly Korean civilians, were killed, and 80% of North Korean cities were flattened. This is why North Korea has developed a highly defensive mindset, and its siege mentality only heightens during the spring and fall when the US and South Korea conduct the world's largest military exercises involving over 200,000 troops, B-2 bombers, and decapitation strikes. North Korea isn't just looking at what happened to Iraq or Libya, but they look back at their own history. So what must we press for in this historic moment? Well, according to James Laney, the former US ambassador to South Korea, what has limited progress between the US and DPRK is the unresolved state of the Korean War. This is a quote from him. A peace treaty would provide a baseline for relationships, eliminating the question of the other's legitimacy and its right to exist. The Korean War was halted with a ceasefire with a promise to negotiate a permanent peace settlement. And who signed this agreement? North Korea, China, and the US on behalf of the UN Command, which included 21 nations that sent troops and assistance to South Korea, such as the UK, Sweden, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. The Korean War was a global war, and we have a historic and moral responsibility to help end it. We must urge our governments to support the inter-Korean peace process and call for a Korea peace treaty. Now, let me end with how global peace movements can support peace in Korea. In 2014, as Ben noted, 30 women peace activists from 15 countries, we walked with 10,000 Korean women, North and South, on both sides of the DMZ. We called for a peace treaty to end the war. We called for reuniting families, and we called for women's leadership in the peace process. Why women? Well, we know that when women's peace movements are involved, it leads to an actual peace agreement. And when we help draft it, it is far more durable. So in this era of the Me Too and women's marches, women must push for a new foreign policy that moves us away from militarism and war and towards genuine security built on cooperation, diplomacy, and peace. So this May, we are actually planning another DMZ crossing, but this time we hope to bring together North and South Korean women. The South Korean Minister of Gender Equality has said that they would support a symposium and a peace walk in the southern side. So we're waiting news from North Korea. And of course, we'll need to get permission from the US forces in Korea as they have jurisdiction over the DMZ. We hope you will all send messages of solidarity and share our action with the world. So let me just close by saying there is great danger in these times, but the future remains unwritten and ours to shape. Please join our movement to end the Korean War with a peace treaty. We are in this historic moment. Let us not turn our backs on the Korean people, but give them our global solidarity. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Christine. Wow, for that critical perspective and vision and the brave and inspiring work that you do. Everything you've just offered is so vital for us to understand as we engage with this moment. And our next speaker, Jenny Town, will add to that understanding. She is joining us live from South Korea, where it is just after 3 a.m., I believe. So huge thank you to Jenny. Jenny is the Associate Director for the U.S. Korea Institute at Johns Hopkins University and is widely regarded as one of the world's leading authorities on the precarious diplomatic situation in North Korea. Jenny frequently advises the public and policymakers on issues related to North Korea, nuclear weapons, and nuclear energy, and has personally participated in diplomatic engagements with North Korea. She's a leading voice on the possibility and necessity of diplomatic progress, and we are lucky to have her insights today. Jenny Town.
Great, thank you. I'm very pleased to be joining you from South Korea to talk about this unique situation. Just about 2 weeks ago, there was great worry that we were on the verge of conflict on the Korean Peninsula as US DPRK brinkmanship continued to push us toward the edge. But with the prospects now of a meeting between Kim Jong-un and Donald Trump, we have an important opportunity to change that narrative and give diplomacy a chance. This meeting did not happen simply by being tough on North Korea. There are many factors at play here. One of the most important, as Christine talked about, was the diplomatic groundwork done by South Korean President Moon Jae-in. His willingness to accept North Korea's diplomatic overtures at the beginning of the year, despite enormous criticism, got the two Koreas to the negotiating table, initially on the issue of the North's participation in the Winter Olympics, and eventually expanding into more substantive areas, reopening direct communication channels between Seoul and Pyongyang, and exploring how far the two Koreas could get on more security-related subjects, from military de-escalation to the prospects of denuclearization. This groundwork created the conditions the US insisted were necessary to restart US DPRK talks, which, as you know, has now led to this planned meeting between Kim and Trump, the first presidential summit between the US and North Korea. The idea of this high-level summit makes many Americans, especially in policy circles, very uncomfortable. This is not how the US usually does diplomacy. In normal times, a high-level summit would come after an agreement is already in place and tangible outcomes have already been achieved. But we all know that these are not normal times. And while we are essentially starting backwards, it could be a productive change of pace. North Korea is, after all, a dictatorship with the ultimate top-down leadership dynamic. Securing the mandate for a sustained diplomatic process from Kim Jong-un on a mutually agreed agenda could give greater room for negotiators to work out the details. And so while it is uncomfortable to start in this way, it holds great potential for putting us on a path towards de-escalation, denuclearization, and eventual normalization of relations. However, it certainly will not be easy, and there's now a lot of work that needs to be done to avoid failure. This means, first, setting clear objectives and expectations for the high-level summit, the most important of which is not overstating what should be accomplished in the summit itself. This is not and should not be approached as a one-off, solve-the-problem event, but as the beginning of a formal, sustained diplomatic negotiation process. Second, we need to prepare for success. Yes, we know there are vacancies in key positions that are focused on this issue, but that doesn't have to be debilitating. Instead, now is the time to make this work. Put together the team needed for this unorthodox process that includes both issue experts and experienced negotiators, especially those who have Trump's confidence. In this sense, the transition of Tillerson to Pompeo for Secretary of State may actually be a positive development. It was clear Tillerson and Trump weren't on the same page, and despite Pompeo's more hawkish views on North Korea, his closer relationship with Trump may instill more confidence on both sides as they move forward, assuming he will adapt to the diplomatic challenge ahead. This means, third, conducting pre-summit meetings directly with the North Koreans. While the South Koreans have skillfully played the role of mediator between the US and North Korea, communication is now needed on the logistics, as well as on clarifying what will be on the agenda to making sure that all parties are clear-eyed going into the summit. Finally, this means ensuring close consultation between the US and its allies, especially South Korea, as they engage in inter-Korean talks. While this is a bilateral summit, this is certainly not a bilateral situation. And the US needs to factor in the interests of our allies in our negotiations if we want any long-term sustainable outcome. Frequent, consistent, and sincere exchanges need to be taking place to better understand what our interests are, what our bottom lines are, and how we as allies plan to move forward. We avoid decoupling and undermining each other's efforts by being actual partners in this process and understanding all of the moving pieces at play. This course of action does not come without risks or criticisms, and perceived failure could put us back down a dangerous path. And skepticism of North Korea's intentions is high. The critics who think that being tough is the only way to make progress on North Korea will continue to undermine diplomacy. In South Korea, President Moon showed he was willing to shoulder that criticism and has gotten us to where we are today. For those of us who believe there is no military solution to this problem, we need to be the voices of support for diplomacy, not just the summit, but encouraging of a serious diplomatic full court press by all parties to do the tough work needed to change the nature of this situation. Thank you.
Wow, thank you, Jenny. Thank you so much. I know you had to get up at 3 a.m. to give us your thoughts, but you should know that you're being heard by over 8,000 people from 30 plus different countries who are actively listening and chatting and processing what you're saying. All of us are very lucky to have such grounded and thoughtful views about what the summit actually means and how all of us can help seize the potential of this moment, even in the face of so much uncertainty with the characters involved. Thank you. I now want to turn to our next speaker, Raed Gerard. Raed leads Amnesty International's engagement with the US government on issues pertaining to human rights in the Middle East and North Africa. As a leading representative of civil society in that region, Raed has testified in numerous congressional hearings and briefings, and he is also a top commentator in both Arabic and English language media. Raed and his family were in Iraq when the US and allied troops invaded 15 years ago, and his story will help all of us understand the ongoing human consequences of war, as well as our collective responsibility to deal with what comes next. Raed Gerard.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. While we're discussing the prospects of a new war, maybe with North Korea, talking today about the Iraq war is as important as ever. It's important to talk about the human consequences of wars. Wars are not only a policy option, there are actual people who pay prices for these actions. So as Ben mentioned, 15 years ago, I was in Baghdad with my family, and we were planning for the big invasion to happen. I was helping my father dig a well in our backyard, and my parents bought a new generator with fuel. They really turned their house into this fortress that should have helped us stay there for maybe months under an invasion war. Unfortunately, we couldn't last there for more than a couple of weeks after the US bombardment started. My neighborhood was heavily attacked, and we had to flee the neighborhood and stay at different houses with my uncles, with other relatives. So by the time that April 9th arrived, I witnessed the first US tanks roll down the streets of Baghdad. Unfortunately, at the time, I also witnessed the death and destruction of many neighborhoods in Baghdad, the death of many civilians. So at the time, the US tried to promote that war as a smart war, as a war that only killed the bad guys. I was only an architect with a blog at the time, but I decided to get more involved in showing the world that that war, like every other war, had a very heavy human cost. So I joined forces with an American visitor at the time, Marla Rosica, who was just establishing a campaign to collect information about civilian casualties. And I ended up running the civilian casualty in Iraq, where we documented that thousands of Iraqis who were civilians were killed and injured only in the first 100 days of the invasion and occupation. Thousands. Of course, now the number has grown to hundreds of thousands or even over 1 million, according to some estimates. Even more than 1 million Iraqis have been killed since the US-led invasion of 2003. Of course, millions others have been injured and displaced out of the country. Now, like many people on this call would imagine that the 2003 date marks the beginning of the war in Iraq. Unfortunately, if you ask many Iraqis, 2003 only starts a new chapter of war, which is the invasion and military occupation. The war in Iraq or on Iraq started back in 1991 and has not stopped yet. From an Iraqi perspective, the US military intervention started with dropping bombs in January of 1991, continued all through the 90s with bombing and military sanctions, and has not ended till now. The US still bombs Iraq and has troops on the ground until this day. So the US really destroyed the country. Like the Iraq that I lived in has been completely dismantled. Not only the infrastructure, not only the cities, not only the neighborhoods, but also demographically. Almost every human being who I know has left the country since the 2003 invasion. I used to have all of my family, loved ones, neighbors, colleagues, workers, everyone who I knew lived within a few minutes of driving from where I lived. And now people live from Canada to New Zealand. My family has spread all over the world. And Iraq was destroyed not only from that perspective, but also from its national identity. Before 2003, people didn't really talk that much about who's Sunni and who's Shiite and who's Kurdish. Now these sub-identities destroyed the Iraqi national identity. So Iraq national unity, the existence of the country, has been unfortunately destroyed. At the time, back in 15 years ago, I was also participating in activities that opposed the US-led war on the country. And I know many people on this call might have been involved in those activities. When I moved to the US in 2006, I also, 2005 and 2006, I helped with many of the anti-war movement's efforts here in the US. Now I work with Amnesty International, and Amnesty International, for those who are not familiar with it, it's a global movement of almost 7 million people around the world, over 1 million here in the US alone. And while Amnesty International is not an anti-war organization per se, we do document the violations committed on a daily basis, war crimes committed by the US allies, by US partners, and by other players in Iraq who emerged as a consequence to the US invasion of the country. So the point that I want to make before closing is that there are so many social movements now that have so much momentum, and without working together with those who are documenting war crimes, with those who are working on environmental issues, with those who are working on gun issues, or even social justice issues, I think it will make it much easier for the anti-war movement and anti-war voices to be more effective if we all work together. Let me stop here, and I hopefully will address some of your questions in the question and answer period.
Wow, thank you, Raed. Very powerful, stirring insights and personal sharing, and the courage that you and so many of your friends and loved ones exhibited to get to where you are is staggering. And thank you for bringing to light the reality that the cost of war doesn't end when the headlines fade, and therefore neither does our responsibility as a global community to act for peace. It's with that responsibility in mind that Move On in the US has built up a massive volunteer-led crisis response network. To give us a sense of what that looks like, we have Rachel Maiori, a longtime Move On member and one of the star grassroots organizers of the Crisis Response Network. Just before I turn the floor over to Rachel, I've been notified that we are now up to 11,000 folks across the world watching through both this channel and the Move On Facebook Live channel. So it's really inspiring. And I want to remind all of you as well that you probably have lots of questions and thoughts for Raed, and you'll be able to pose them in our question section and beyond. So take it away, Rachel.
Thank you, Ben. Hi, everyone. My name is Rachel Mayori. I'm a proud member of Move On and a host for the Move On Crisis Response Network. When I first heard that Move On had joined with national allies to build a grassroots network to stop a potential US war or a possible domestic crackdown on civil liberties, I wanted in. This is how I feel I can take action against oppression and strengthen the resistance. This is how I work for peace and stand in solidarity, especially with communities on the front lines of this current administration's attacks. Should they be needed, Move On has 870 strategic events ready to go throughout the United States at record speed. Ultimately, the Move On Crisis Response Network is about connection. With lots of supporting organizations, we are not only resisting, we are building our movement and growing our power. At this critical crossroads in history, we are the people who will ensure we all get through this. As part of Move On's Crisis Response Network, I feel I've linked arms with thousands of other progressive activists to build this network. While I hope every single day, and I'm sure you all do too, that we never face this type of crisis, I'm heartened that the network exists, and I'm proud to be a part of it. I stand with all of you to reject oppression and create a peaceful, fair, equitable world together. Thank you so much.
Oh, wow. Rachel, thank you so much. I know you speak for so many of us, and I think touched a lot of us very directly when you talk about that hunger to get active and do whatever we can locally about these issues that we care so much about. Move On is a founding member of the Open Network, which is a group of organizations that work in a similar way, member-driven, campaigning, grassroots organizations that are now in nearly 20 countries around the world. We're all coming together today to express our shared concern and common stake in these issues that affect all of us. So let's take a moment and hear from the network directly. I love these folks. I know you will too. Here they are.
Hi everyone, I'm Weronika from Akcja Demokracja in Poland, Warsaw. I'm happy to be here today at this call.
Hi there, we're Campax from Switzerland. We're known for cheese and chocolate and neutrality, but when it comes to war, we're not neutral at all. We don't want it.
Hi everyone, it's Dora, and I'm happy to join you as the Hungarian voice, Ahang from Budapest.
Hi, we're from Lead Now in Canada, and I'm Rachel in Toronto.
And I'm Chloe in Vancouver.
Kia ora, hello, my name is Laura and I am from Action Station in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and really happy to be here on the call today. I think it's incredibly important.
Namaste, I'm Samay Lama from Gurjin, Nepal, and I am super excited and happy to be here today at this call.
Good evening, my name is Elliot from Le Mouvement in France. We know that Emmanuel Macron has a strong relationship with Donald Trump, and we are willing to use this relationship to help build a strong path toward peace.
It's just after 5 a.m. in Sydney, Australia, and I'm Danny from Get Up.
Salut, I'm Roxana, greetings from Cluj. I am here in Romania representing the clique.
Hello, I am Kokito Moete from Amanda.mobi in South Africa.
Hi, my name's Robin and I'm in London, England, and I'm representing 38 Degrees in the UK. We're excited to be working with this global community to help prevent another tragic and unnecessary war.
Hi everyone, this is Berlin in Germany. Marita Strasser from Campact. Hallo allerseits, hier aus Berlin, Marita Strasser von Campact.
Hi, my name is Jussi, I'm the chairperson of Aufstehen and I'm calling in from Vienna, Austria.
My name is Anna from Skiftet in Sweden. Sweden hasn't been in war for 200 years. And we wish that other countries could have the same.
Hi everyone, it's Mayan from the Zim Community Action in Israel.
Hi everyone, my name is Jurgen from the Goede Zaak in the Netherlands. During the Iraq War, we had a strong anti-war movement. And if we would be unfortunate enough to find ourselves in a similar situation again, we will surely mobilize for an even stronger response.
Díagwith Corja, we're Uplift from Ireland. I'm Siobhan, and we're delighted to be with you today.
That was great. It's inspiring to feel how connected we are and how easy it is to actually discover common values in every corner of the world. I think that's probably the best part of the open network is we find sisters and brothers who share values just everywhere, and we come together for these common purposes in these moments. So let me pivot now, speaking of common purpose, to our next speaker. This speaker is known to us all, considered a hero by so many of us in the United States and around the world. Senator Sanders has smashed the old political myth that there's only so much truth you can tell about what's really going on if you want to be taken seriously and make a real difference. He set a new bar globally for holding those in power accountable to the actual lived experience of regular people, for calling out the rot of deep inequality, and for challenging all of us to hold on fiercely to our highest aspirations for what we can do together to make the world as much better a place as we can possibly imagine. So it is my tremendous honor to turn over the floor now to Senator Bernie Sanders.
Well, let me thank you very much, and let me thank Move On for helping to organize this event, and to thank all of the people throughout the world for coming together. I think we all understand that the great global crises are not going to be solved country by country. They're only going to be solved when millions and hundreds of millions of people come together to demand a fundamental change in global priorities. And certainly at the top of that list is the need to end war and destruction and work toward a global peace. So again, I want to thank everybody for the work that they are doing. We're in this together. Today, we are here to mark a very somber anniversary. And that is the beginning of the Iraq War in 2003. 15 years ago this week, the bombs started falling on Baghdad. Shock and awe was what the Bush administration called it, and the news media repeated it, creating the expectation that US military power would make the war quick and easy. I think we all remember that. The theory was that Saddam Hussein would be overthrown in a few weeks, democracy in Iraq would be established, American troops would return home in a few months, and everything would be wonderful from then on out. Well, it didn't quite happen like that. Later, we would all be shocked and awed at the disaster that they had created, because war is never quick and it is never easy. I remember vividly, because I was in Congress at the time, all of the rhetoric that came from the Bush administration, that came from my Republican colleagues and some Democrats as well, about why going to war in Iraq was the right thing to do. Well, it wasn't. In fact, it is one of the great tragedies in modern history. It is very easy to give speeches on the safety of the floor of the Senate or in the House. It is a little bit harder to experience war and live through the devastation of war and to deal with the aftermath, the consequences. I was one of those who opposed the war at the beginning. Today, it is now broadly acknowledged that the war in Iraq was a foreign policy blunder of enormous magnitude. The war created a cascade of instability around the region that we are still dealing with today in Syria and elsewhere, and will be for many years to come. Indeed, had it not been for the Iraq War, ISIS would almost certainly not exist. The war deepened hostilities between Sunni and Shia communities in Iraq and elsewhere. It exacerbated a regional struggle for power between Saudi Arabia and Iran and their proxies in places like Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen, and it undermined American diplomatic efforts to resolve the Palestinian conflict. The devastation experienced by Iraq's civilians was unbelievable. A recent academic study by US, Canadian, and Iraqi researchers found that over 400,000 Iraqi civilians, nearly 500,000 people, were killed directly or indirectly as a consequence of the war. The war led to the deaths of some 4,400 US troops and the wounding, physical and emotional, of tens of thousands of others. The war led to the displacement of nearly 5 million people, both inside and outside of Iraq, putting great stress on the ability of surrounding countries to deal with these refugee flows. We've also seen this more recently in Europe, as the large numbers of people fleeing the Syrian war has generated a backlash in European countries, giving rise to anti-Muslim and anti-immigrant sentiments that have been exploited by right-wing politicians. And by the way, that war in Iraq cost trillions of dollars, money that could have been spent on addressing the massive levels of poverty and hopelessness that exist all over the developing world, where hundreds of millions of people today live in extreme poverty and where many children around the world die as a result of easily prevented diseases. The Iraq War, like so many other military conflicts, had unintended consequences. It ended up making us less safe, not more safe. The Iraq War also set a precedent, a very dangerous precedent, that large countries like the United States could attack small countries with impunity. Instead of moving us forward toward a world without war, where international conflicts are settled through negotiations and diplomacy, we now see wars all over the world and a significant increase in global military spending. For example, right here in the United States, Congress just voted to increase the Defense Department budget by $165 billion over a 2-year period. No one disagrees that Saddam Hussein was a brutal, murderous dictator, but it's now known that he had nothing to do with 9/11. The American people were misled by the Bush administration into believing that the Iraq war was necessary to prevent another 9/11. 40 years before that, in 1964, President Lyndon Johnson cited an attack on a U.S. ship in the Gulf of Tonkin as a pretext for escalating the U.S. intervention in Vietnam. We now know that his administration misled both Congress and the American people into that war, just as the Bush administration did in Iraq. Time and time again, we see disasters when leaders refuse to tell their people the truth. And let's remember that the people of the world were not silent about the Iraq war. In the months leading up to the invasion, there were huge and unprecedented demonstrations in the United States and, in fact, all over the world opposing that war. The truth is that in country after country, what people were saying is that we need to invest in our children, in our elderly, and in healthcare and in education and environmental protection. We do not want more and more war. The people in my country, in the United States, and all over the world are sick and tired of spending billions of dollars on nuclear weapons, warplanes, missiles, bombs, and tanks. Our job together in each of our countries is to bring our people together around an agenda that calls for peace, not war, development, not destruction. Let me say a brief word about some of the shared global challenges that we face today. The growth of oligarchy and income and wealth inequality is not just an American issue. It is a global issue. Globally, the top 1% now owns more wealth than the bottom 99% of the world's population. Increasingly, in the United States and around the world, we see an economic and political system in which a small number of multi-billionaires and corporate interests have increased control over the world's economic life, our political life, and our media. And these people are working night and day just to make themselves even richer. Just a few years ago, it was estimated that the wealthiest people and most profitable corporations in the world have stashed at least $21 trillion in offshore tax havens to avoid paying their fair share of taxes. The situation has become so absurd that one 5-story building in the Cayman Islands, which has a 0% corporate tax rate, is now the home of nearly 20,000 companies. In other words, while the very, very rich become much richer, governments around the world institute austerity programs because they lack the funds to provide decently for their constituents. Inequality, corruption, oligarchy, and authoritarianism are inseparable. They must be understood as part of the same system and fought and opposed in the same way. Around the world, we have witnessed the rise of demagogues who, once in power, use their positions to loot the state of its resources. These kleptocrats, like Putin in Russia and many others, use divisiveness and abuse as a tool for enriching themselves and those loyal to them. The last years have obviously seen very troubling political developments in many countries around the world, particularly in Europe and also here in the United States. The rise of intolerant, authoritarian political movements is something that should concern each and every one of us. These movements have drawn strength from the fact that more and more people have lost faith in their systems of government and are desperate for alternatives. They see their governments as corrupt, ineffective, and not delivering for them or providing opportunities and a better future for their children. The problem is when you see leaders who tell the people, I can deliver you security, opportunity, and a future, it's those people over there who are taking it away from you. They point to politically unpopular groups, ethnic and religious minorities, immigrants, refugees, and blame these groups for all the trouble, and then propose to strip these groups of their rights. That is how the demagogues work. They gain power by claiming to speak for the people's legitimate desires, but always end up using that power to oppress them. They claim to speak for the many, but really represent the very few. We have seen this played out before many times in history. Further, we cannot forget when we talk about global crises, the crisis of climate change. My friends, it is time for us to get serious about this issue. The scientific community is virtually unanimous in telling us that climate change is real, it is caused by human activity, and it is already causing devastating harm throughout the world. Further, what the scientists tell us is that if we do not act boldly together to address this crisis of climate change, this planet will see more drought, more floods, and more types of devastation. Furthermore, what we will see is a level of migration of people moving away from their areas where they cannot grow foods or have drinkable water, which will cause all kinds of other threats to global stability and security. The threat of climate change is a very clear example of why we all need to pull together. We are in this together. The United States can't do it alone, Europe can't do it alone, China can't do it alone, and no one country can do this alone. This is a crisis that calls out for strong international cooperation if we are to leave our children and our grandchildren a planet that is healthy and habitable. So let me just conclude by again thanking all of you who are watching this program, who understand that we need to stand together to rally the people for social, economic, political, and racial justice, and that the only way we're going to solve international problems is when people throughout the world come together. So once again, let me thank Move On for organizing this important event, and thank all of you for participating. Look forward to working with you in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Senator Sanders. We're so grateful for your leadership and your time with all of us today and those inspiring and insightful remarks. Thank you. I want to move now quickly into questions. We want to turn this over to the many participants. Of course, there are thousands, I think over 11,000 of us around the world, and we're only going to have time for just a few questions, but I'm going to start that off now. Question number one from David in Cardiff. How can we end the ongoing cruelty of war? Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Yemen. How do we take profit out of war? So this is from David in Cardiff. And if I could ask all of my speakers to come back to the stage, turning on your microphone and camera. Any, Christine, Jenny, Raed, any of you can leap in and address this.
I can maybe start. I mean, I will say a few thoughts here, and I'm sure others will add. One thing we can do is exposing the war crimes that happen on a daily basis, and exposing those behind war crimes, whether they are governments or corporations. We shouldn't forget that many of these wars are fought with bombs manufactured in the US and other countries, and those corporations also hold responsibility to make sure that their weapons are not being used to violate international humanitarian law. So like the mere fact of us documenting and exposing many of these crimes contributes to making war more costly, more inefficient, and more controversial to those governments who want to wage war. One more thing I want to say is that many people around the world ask questions about US-led wars. What can they do? And I would say pressuring their governments to oppose these wars, deny the US the political cover it needs, or even deny the US the logistical needs that it needs to implement many of these wars.
Maybe I'll quickly jump on the question from Kate. What did we learn from the Iraq anti-war movement that we can help stop a war in its tracks today? For example, a war on North Korea. And I would say that, what I recall was people taking to the streets. And as we may recall some of the videos that were shown and the images of masses, millions of people taking to the streets, I think that we need to revive that action. The light that we present as a peace movement, inspires other people around the world. And so I think that is a lesson. And I think that we're trying to take concrete actions, but we need to engage in the political process. We need to put pressure on our political leaders, and there are leaders like Bernie Sanders that will help lead, Congress, for example, from preventing, hopefully, a U.S. invasion, first strike on North Korea. But we have to, I totally agree with Raed, that we have to expose those who are profiteering, and as Medea Benjamin says, making a killing off of killing. That's why we need to have a new foreign policy that isn't about occupation and invasion, but one that's hopefully moving towards peace and diplomacy. But we need to get mobilized. It will take us to actually put pressure on our political leaders.
Thank you. I want to pose a question from Mary. This is in the English channel. How do we end the Syrian and Yemenis crisis? How do those connect to Iran, and are they connected to Korea? So I'm going to throw that open to any of the panelists who want to speak about those conflicts and their connections.
I can comment if no one else wants to jump in. I would say there is a lot to do when it comes to Syria and Yemen. It's a humanitarian crisis. It's a political crisis. It's a disaster. In Yemen, we're talking about a country on the brink of famine. There are millions of Yemenis who need urgent access to humanitarian aid, to food, to medicine. So it's not just about ending the military attacks, but it is also about letting in food and medications. And the US and its allies, the Saudi-led coalition, they have a lot to do with this humanitarian crisis. They can end it. It's a humanitarian crisis that is created by governments. In Syria, we also see how many governments are involved there. there are daily war crimes committed. We saw what happened in Ghouta, eastern Ghouta, in the last few weeks. Almost 1,400 civilians have been slaughtered by the Syrian government and the Russian government and their allies. So many of these, I think, exposing many of these war crimes, naming names and holding these governments accountable. But as I mentioned earlier, Amnesty International has documented bombs used by US weapon manufacturers, by Raytheon, by Lockheed Martin. We have to also name and shame these weapon manufacturers and let them know that it's their personal responsibility, it's their corporate responsibility to ensure that their bombs are not being used to kill civilians around the world.
Can I
Thank you,
add to that?
Jenny, please.
So, and I think, the connection with Korea here is, on some level, you really have to understand that Korea is almost a distraction. And so if we really want to address what's happening in Yemen and in Syria, it's not getting enough attention. Like, North Korea is dominating the headlines, when the situation in North Korea is not what it is in an active conflict zone. So, I think, there's been a lot of masterful sort of distraction to keep attention on a potential issue rather than focusing and giving enough attention to what's happening on the ground in places where conflict is actually happening now. And I think, the more you can bring and highlight that, and the more we can get that more into the media, and the more people can talk about that more publicly, I think will also help the situation.
Thank you, Jenny. Thank you to all of our speakers and to all of our participants. There are so many questions. We only have time to get to a few. There's a whole bunch of questions that have come in that are around the theme of how do we stay connected and what can we do next? What are some actions we can take? And those are coming in from our German language speakers and from Ireland and all over. So I want to use this as an opportunity to segue into the last bit of our conversation today. And I'm going to turn the floor back over to Christine to share a proposal for a powerful next act of solidarity that we can take together as a global community to move forward this message of peace. So, Christine.
Thank you so much, Ben. And as I noted about the lessons that we learned from the lead up to the U.S. invasion of Iraq was just seeing the incredible images of people taking to the streets, calling for peace, calling for no invasion. I think we need to kind of replicate that in this potential moment where there could be war or peace on the Korean Peninsula. And so, as Jenny and I noted in our talks earlier, it was the South Korean social movements that really ushered in Moon Jae-in, who has skillfully navigated the rising tensions between Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un, and has brought us to this diplomatic historic moment. And so I think that we need to show our solidarity to the Korean people whose lives are the ones that would be most at stake in the case of a U.S. first strike. And so what we're proposing is a global virtual candlelight vigil. Very simple. It would just be 3 steps. One is you would take a picture of yourself. You would either with your family, your friends, and hopefully you would hold up a sign that would say, I'm Christine On. I'm writing from Honolulu, Hawaii. I'm holding a candle, and that you would take that photo and that you would tweet it on social media. And the Twitter handle is you would tweet #Callfor Peace #. And you can also send the photos by email to callforpeace@flickr.com. CALLFORPEACE@flickr.com. And what we'll do is we will compile all of these images. We will put them together in a beautiful collage. People from Germany, from Sweden, from France, from throughout the Africas, throughout Asia, and we will compile them together, and we will bring them, and we will send them to the people in South Korea, to the peace movements, and I will carry them across the DMZ to North Korea to let the North Korean women and people know that there is international support for peace on the Korean Peninsula. So as the South Korean social movements brought us light and hope with their candlelight vigils, let's shine our light back to them. and do this simple action. Let's do it today. Let's do it within a week. And let's see all the incredible images that come together in a single unified voice, calling for peace and diplomacy, not war. And as Bernie said, no more destruction. So that's one simple action. We hope you will all join us in this global call for peace.
Thank you, Christine. Thank you so much for that. What a beautiful suggestion. And I'm going to take you up on it. I'm sure so many of the folks around this call are going to take you up on it. Just to put that in perspective, I just got word that we've got 19,000 viewers on Facebook and over 8,000 on Crowdcast. So we're talking about 27,000 people from we don't know how many countries at this point around the world. That's an inspiring place to start. So this call for action, this conversation we've just had, this call for the virtual candlelight march, it's just a first step, but I think it could be a really exciting one. The hashtag again is #callforpeace, and the email address is callforpeace@Flickr, which is spelled FLICKR, no E, FLICKR.com. And we'll get all those photos and Christine will bring them. So thanks again for everyone. I think the most important take home from all of this is that when we're faced with these huge, daunting global challenges, Russia, Korea, Yemen, Syria, you name it, when we come together, we are not spectators. We are participants. And when we work together, we are powerful participants. So much more so because of the vision and analysis and wisdom that our speakers have brought to us today, and the millions of members around the world, part of all of the open network organizations and our allies bring in all of their work. It's that energy, that inspiration, that unshakable principle from those millions of grassroots activists that make this network what it is, that is a constant and unrelenting source of hope. So thanks to all, and may peace be with all of us. Good night.